Welcome back to SMNI. This is Business and Politics. Professor Rene, another recent visitor to China was the French President Emmanuel Macron. And this has been getting a lot of news lately because he seems to be out of step with the rest of Europe and certainly out of step with the United States. But his message seems to be about what they call de-risking, which sounds similar to what you were saying a while ago about diversifying, right? Don't depend on one country. I guess that was Europe's lesson with Ukraine and Russia. They were overly dependent on Russia for their energy requirements. So they're talking about possibly de-risking, and the opposite side, or the alternative to that, would be decoupling from China, which I think something that may be heard from the United States these days. What do you think? What is the more prudent approach, I think, from the Philippine perspective?
Again, this is really, every action you take would have certain consequences.
Sure.
Macron is now, of course, facing the backlash from the European Union and even from Germany.
Yes.
So he had to suffer the consequence of that possible action. Again, whether he could push through or not with that, his initiative will depend, of course, on his determination.
Yeah.
So that's also our case. You have, of course, those opportunities and challenges facing us, and every action you take will always have, of course, consequences, backlash, so forth and so on. So what really matters at the end of the day is the willingness of your leaders to take that risk.
Yeah. I wonder if you've been following that initiative of China to maybe press for some peace talks in Ukraine. And this was something that was also discussed during Macron's visit, that maybe we should not be so dismissive about China's policy, because the West was, right, because it didn't have any provisions on returning Ukraine lands. But still, the point was maybe to sit down and talk about it. I know the whole world is skeptical, but Emmanuel Macron was somehow willing to give it a chance. What do you think? Should there be something there, given China's role in the South China Sea, and is there
well, specifically, if we focus on Ukraine, I think before you will have any breakthrough in terms of peace negotiation, we might still have to be settled on the battlefield.
Okay.
If the Ukrainians will be able to inflict a major victory against the Russians at a certain point, then both sides will start negotiating. That's a possibility. But again, at this point in time, if you have to look at what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Ukraine, this is, whatever major developments would happen, will still have to be settled in the battlefield.
Yeah, because I think people who were skeptical about the Chinese initiative in Ukraine would probably be surprised to hear that that China also played a sort of a peacemaking role that led to the restoration of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, this is very beneficial to the Philippines because it gives more stability to that region where we have millions of workers.
Sure.
Something that the United States was not able to do. But should we be maybe encouraging China to do that? And maybe, do you think, because as you said, they don't have to listen to anybody else because they're the bigger power, should we be encouraging that in the hopes of maybe this will spill over?
Yes, we have to use the power of moral suasion.
Yeah.
To impress upon China, you have the oldest civilization.
Yeah.
You have, you're the largest country in the region.
Yeah.
You have the second largest economy in the world. So it's your responsibility to ensure that there'll be peace and stability.
Okay.
Because in the long run, geography, history favors you if you want to become, of course, a great power to, be respected. But as a great power, you also have responsibility.
Right.
So we could try that approach. Whether that will work or not, we simply don't know.
Right.
If we could basically generate in China that sense that any great power in the past would also have to recognize its responsibility to the other powers.
But do you think that maybe that message would resonate more in China if it was not just the Philippines talking, but maybe as
ASEAN? That's the role of ASEAN. Hopefully that will be the message of ASEAN.
But do you think that's possible? And maybe the follow-up to that, would China even welcome a more unified ASEAN? Because
That's another challenge.
some people may say that China would not want a strong ASEAN. That they would prefer to be fragmented.
If you'll have also realization in China that this is a better path than, of course, a major conflict against the United States.
Okay.
So sometimes, of course, the fear of conflict might force a great power to basically take the different approach.
Okay.
So that's what happened during the Cold War.
How do we influence that? I mean, because we are a founding member of ASEAN, but of course ASEAN has this policy of non-interference. I mean,
No, it's external in ASEAN. We have to... there was, of course, an attempt by Indonesia for ASEAN to come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy, but of course it failed, unfortunately, on the part of Indonesia, primarily because each ASEAN country has already their respective policy vis-a-vis dealing with the great powers.
Right.
So ASEAN member states paid lip service to the Indo-Pacific outlook, of Indonesia. So I think this could be a start. Indonesia will be the chair of ASEAN this year. So it can engage Indonesia to how ASEAN could hopefully use moral suasion. Of course, ASEAN has been using moral suasion on China for several decades. It has not yet worked because our calculation is just like, a middle power, any other middle power, China will be persuaded. We simply failed to take into account China views developments here from the perspective of great power.
Now, let me ask you about the domestic policy as implications of what we're talking about, because you obviously advise senior people to our security departments, also our diplomats. Diplomacy is not an easy game, but do you think the Filipino diplomats and security personnel are up to the task in maybe navigating a safe way for the Philippines that serve our interests without necessarily making it worse for everyone in the world?
Yeah, we have the best.
We have the skills.
We have the skills. We have that institutional knowledge. But of course, the main challenge, the main problem, this was raised by some of my friends, especially in the diplomatic corps, is they tend to be risk adverse.
Okay.
So this is something that, of course, the armed forces, and even, of course, the diplomatic service will have to take into account in this very challenging moment.
Right.
We have to basically take sometimes necessary risks.
Right. And something related to that, there's been a shift in military policy in the Philippines, where they used to focus on internal security. Now they're focused on protecting our international interests, our national borders. What's your take on that? Of course, from China's perspective, this can be interpreted as something very aggressive, but for us, it only makes sense, right? What do you think of that policy?
That's, it's long overdue.
Okay.
In fact, the policy began during the time of the Aquino administration.
Okay.
2012, after the Scarborough Shoal standoff, you have some money, you have, of course, some policy directing it, but then, of course, at the end of the day, during the Aquino administration, there was a question of whether there's enough money. President Duterte put his money where his mouth is. President Marcos, basically, it's really high time that we really shift. It's high time that we have to back our diplomacy with a credible military capability. Diplomacy is the velvet glove that covers the iron fist of the military capability. So at least at credible level, we should develop it so that we could not simply rely on our alliance.
Right.
Alliance is convenient, but at the same time, at the end of the day, the responsibility of defending our country, backing our diplomacy, would be, of course, on the hands of the armed forces of the Philippines.
Okay. Now, something that may be related to that is this whole discussion about reviving ROTC, right? Do you see that connection, or do you see that as something separate?
It's connected.
Separate altogether?
We have to educate our youth.
Okay.
We have to prepare our youth for possible eventualities.
Okay, right.
So that's a way of also maintaining national cohesion and, more importantly, patriotism.
Right. Now, how do we instill that in our young people? Because we have this young generation. I don't know what generation, X or Y or they're a lot of people my age view them as something
Our
very
age. Our age.
something very different. I don't pretend to understand that generation, but how do we instill that, as you said, nationalism, that concern for the Philippines? What is the best way? Is it through ROTC? Is it through something else?
Education.
Yeah.
Development of
culture?
civic culture.
Okay.
Not just culture, civic culture.
Okay.
Starting, of course, in the primary education.
Okay.
Also, of course, making people generally aware of the happening and the need, of course, for national cohesion.
Okay. Okay. And
We have to believe in something.
Yeah.
That should be the basis of our national existence.
yeah, and that's the point. But how do we unite the Filipinos, right? When there are so many things that seemingly divide us, right?
Well, that's where, of course, what our president has been calling for.
Okay.
National unity. He started with that, campaign slogan, national unity.
Okay.
And he is stuck with it during the campaign period. Now, of course, he's the president. That is, of course, his primary task.
Right. Do you think it's something realistic? Do you think it's something that can be done?
We have to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Okay. Okay.
We have to believe in what he's saying, or nothing will happen.
Right. So we have to believe in ourselves. I think is
Yes,
the
and of
first
course, the
step.
importance of national unity. We can have discussion, we can have debate, we could criticize certain aspects of the country's foreign policy, but at the end of the day, we have to understand we constitute one Filipino nation.
That's very well said. Professor, it's been very nice to have you here in Business and Politics. I hope that we can talk some more, but
Sure,
our
I'm at your beck and call.
our time tonight has expired. But before we go, maybe you'd like to leave us a message for our audience?
Well, that's a point I raised, that we have a president here who started, in his time that he started his candidacy, is always saying only one thing.
Okay.
National unity, national unity. Of course, he became the president. At the onset of his presidency, already acknowledged the ruling.
Okay.
And of course, had made decisions that was aimed to maintain a balanced foreign policy. So let's give him that chance. Let's give him a chance to succeed. But we can only give him the chance to succeed if we support his policy, no matter whether it's controversial or not. We only have one president and one country.
We have to do our part.
We have to do our part.
Well, thank you very much, Rene. I'd like to thank our viewers watching this program, those watching live and watching the replay. I'd also like to thank Pastor Apollo Kibuloy for making this program possible. This has been Business and Politics. I will see you next week.